Good evening, and welcome to Turn the Page, a continuing series of author conversations from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Tonight's event is entitled Escaping War, What We Can Learn from Stories of the Syrian Refugee Crisis, and is generally sponsored by the Tip City Public Library, which I've had the opportunity to visit, and it's a remarkable place run by some truly remarkable people who love literature. So thank you to Tip City Public Library. I'm Gilbert King, and I'm the 2013 Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up for nonfiction with my book, Devil in the Grove. And I've been known to host the annual award ceremony each year in Dayton, which in my mind is the greatest literary award weekend in the world. So Dayton, hats off to you there. It's a pleasure to introduce two of the newest members of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize community, Christy Lefteri and Jordan Ritter Conn. I'm going to start by introducing the authors. We're going to have a conversation. I also encourage you to go into the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. If you think of questions while you're listening, put them in there. I'll take a look at them and read them. But I do have a lot of great questions from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize community. And so we're ready to start. I'm going to start by introducing Christy. Brought up in Lundy, Christy Lefteri is the child of Cypriot refugees who moved to the UK in 1974 during the Turkish invasion. She's a lecturer in creative writing at Brunel University. A Watermelon, a Fish, and a Bible is her first novel. The Beekeeper of Aleppo is her second, and it received the 2020 Aspen Words Literary Prize, as well as the 2020 Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up for fiction. Welcome, Christy.
Hello.
Good to see you. Jordan Ritter Conn is a staff writer for The Ringer. He previously worked at Grantland, the ESPN, the magazine, and he has written for the New York Times and Sports Illustrated. He's a two-time finalist for the Livingston Award, and his work has been cited or recognized by the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Slate. The Road from Raqqa is also the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up for nonfiction. Jordan, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So glad to be here.
Oh, it's really great. We're going to start out with some questions from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize community, and we'll come back at the end and do some questions from the audience as well. But I want to start out with a question for both of you to consider. You represent 2 years of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Christy, you were fiction runner-up in 2020, and Jordan, you were nonfiction runner-up in 2021. You share the same editor, Andrew Miller, at Ballantine Books. When did you first learn of each other's books, and did you connect with each other before or after publication?
I can answer that if that's
okay,
or at least start and give my take. So my experience with Ballantine was my book had been acquired. In nonfiction, you submit a proposal and then an editor bids on your proposal, and then you have to write the book, rather than I think with fiction more often you write the book and then connect to an editor. And so I had submitted a proposal and had it had a deal with Ballantine, and the editor who initially I was intended to work with moved on to another position. And as he was leaving, he said, you're going to be in great hands. We have another editor who is fantastic to work with. She typically edits fiction. Mine was nonfiction, but it seemed like that was still going to be a really great fit. And he said she's actually just been working on this novel that's about Syria that's about to come out, and it's called The Beekeeper of Aleppo. And so at first, my initial reaction was just like, okay, this is someone who knows this part of the world, who is passionate about stories from this part of the world, and I'm going to be in good hands. And working with Andrea was a dream. I think as a nonfiction writer, being able to work with a fiction editor, she just brought a different kind of eye to the page than nonfiction editors and journalistic editors usually do. And it was soon after that I then read The Beekeeper of Aleppo and was blown away. I for those who have read it, the way that Christy structures that novel, and the way that, without giving it away for those who haven't, the way that one chapter kind of goes to the next. The first time I read that happen, it literally took my breath away. And the way she moves back and forth through time, I was just amazed by it and kind of honored. I was like, okay,
Thank you.
If this
I'm
person,
blushing.
well, it's true. And I just thought, well, if this person edited this book, then she clearly knows what she's doing. And Andra was phenomenal. And Christy and I was, when I found out that I was nonfiction runner-up, I was so excited to meet Christy in Dayton. Unfortunately, very fortunately, she was having a baby, and so she wasn't able to be there in person. But we just met a few weeks ago in London, and it was really, really wonderful. And so I'm so excited to be reconnected with her here tonight.
And I'm laughing because I also just remember that you said that so for the Dayton Literary Awards, I was watching it on Zoom, and didn't realize that apparently my face had been projected on the screen. And I was just hovering like a huge head, hovering over the stage for what was like half an hour. And I didn't know, I was just sitting there. So Jordan told me about that when we met in London. We met at this lovely Indian restaurant, wasn't it, in Hackney? And I met your wife, and it was really, really nice to meet in person. But yeah, so shall I say what my experience was? So Andra, when I finished editing Beekeeper, I think it must have been about 6 months or so later, she said to me, "Can I send you a book to read? It's nonfiction, it's wonderful." And she sent me a little synopsis. And as soon as I read it, I said to her, "Please, I would honestly love to read it. It sounds absolutely amazing." And especially that it was nonfiction. I mean, I would have loved to have read it if it was fiction, but the fact that it was nonfiction and it was real stories, and I'd spent so long listening to people's stories, and absorbing real life stories, I was so interested to read a nonfiction narrative. And anyway, she sent it to me, and I just remember receiving it and opening it and reading that first page, and just kind of, it was so powerful. It drew me in immediately. And I remember emailing Andra back and saying, "I really love this. I know already that I want to endorse it." It was just, wow. It just got me. It just absolutely got me. So that was my, and then the rest. I didn't get to see you. I didn't get to meet you because I couldn't come to Dayton. I was about 8 months pregnant. But yeah, we did end up meeting in London.
So nice. Well, nobody minded you hovering over there. In fact, you were kind of like a guardian angel over our shoulders, so it was totally fine. So.
Oh my God! And I didn't
Wizard of Oz. It was great. Christy, I'm going to start with a question for you. Okay. Huazu, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize final judge, in citing your work, said, quote, "This is a book about global issues, conflict, the life or death arbitrariness of national borders, the Kafkaesque bureaucratic mazes that exhaust rather than protects those in trouble." Yet Lefteri locates hope and transcendence in small gestures, minor hopes. What small gestures and minor hopes kept your characters alive? Did you see small gestures or hear of minor hopes during your time in the refugee camp in Greece?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. It was these little things that I saw that kind of, it was those little things that really opened my eyes the most. And it was those little things, those little moments that changed my perception of life, and put things into perspective for me as well. So, for example, there were so many families that were coming to, so I didn't work in a camp, I worked in a women and children's centre. So it was a centre where women and children could spend the day and be safe. So there were showers, a play area for children, there was an area for new mothers, etc. And the camps were dire. So it was really important that they had somewhere to go that was different to the camps. So, I mean, it was chaotic. There was a lot of running around, and doing our best to keep the showers clean, look after the children, serve tea and biscuits. However, even in that chaos, I noticed little things that kind of completely filled my heart. For example, the tea and biscuit area, women would come in, and within a few days, they'd start, even if they were isolated or alone to begin with, you'd see the women slowly integrating and talking to maybe one of the women and then another. And then as the days and the weeks passed, friendships, you'd see real friendships developing over tea and biscuits. And it was those friendships that I just thought, look, these people have been through so much, and I'd never experienced a war, but I'd seen it growing up, and in terms of my parents' experience. So it meant so much to me to be able to see these women and the way that they connected with one another, and the way that they built real friendships, and there was real joy and laughter. So it wasn't just misery and darkness, that there was a lot of laughter in that place. In that center, there was playing, children played, and there was laughter as well. And the other thing was the children. So when they first came in, they found it difficult to play. Sometimes they were a bit too shaken up or too traumatized. But as the days passed and as the weeks passed, again, you could see the children kind of relax a bit and be able to play again and be able to imagine, which is something that I observed was quite difficult for the children when they came in, and they were just so kind of, where am I? And is this place safe? And, and the other thing was that when the men dropped off their wives or daughters or sisters or mothers, some often they didn't leave. They sat outside. So they weren't allowed in because it was for women and children only, but they would sit outside and peek in and make sure that their children were safe and make sure that their children were playing, and sit there all day, sometimes just sit there doing nothing. But I found it so touching, just seeing like a man sort of doing this, and there's my daughter, and then sitting back down on the step where he was sitting, and I kind of came away from that, and there was a lot of darkness. I heard a lot of stories that were very, very, very sad, and experienced a lot of things that were really sad. However, those things stayed in my mind. And when I was writing the novel, I remember thinking, but that is where hope lies. It's in these it's in the love that people have for one another, whether it was the men waiting outside for their loved ones, or the women that developed real friendships, or the children that were able to use their imaginations again. That all came from a place of resilience and love and hope. And I took that with me, and I held on to that, because I thought that was such a beautiful thing to be able to see and observe. So I tried to put that into my story and into the characters.
Yeah, those little moments are definitely apparent. That's great. Jordan, I have a question for you. In The Two Brothers, you capture both inclinations when a country is in war. The desperate escape from death and destruction to find a new life, and the equally desperate sense of loyalty to home and country, even in the face of death and destruction. Can the consequences of either decision ever be accepted and forgiven?
That's a big question. I think the decision for anyone facing that choice is just so massive that it can feel overwhelming, and that the consequences, regardless of which you choose, can feel consuming in a way that you don't quite know what to do with. And so I can only speak to the experience of Riyadh and Bashar and others from Syria who I've spoken to about the choices that they've made. But I will say, in these two brothers, Riyadh and Bashar, you have Riyadh, a brother who left Syria for a better life at a relatively young age, before the war ever began. And you have Bashar, who chose to stay and to build a home in the city where their parents had built a home and their ancestors had built a home, and who then clung to that sense of home for years after the war began, and clung to this belief that the home that he had built could be again what it once had been. And for each of them, there are moments of regret in that choice, and moments of just stubborn sticking to the belief that of course they made the right choice. And Riyadh and his life that he built in America often was and still is often filled with the sense of longing for Syria. That became even more pronounced after the war began. He was someone who believed in the spirit of the Syrian revolution, and when it first started, wanted to be there, wanted to be in some way, shape, or form kind of fighting for the future of his country. And then Bashar, who so stubbornly clung to this belief that they needed to stay, that they needed to be in the home that their ancestors had built, watched as friends died, watched as his daughters and young son were traumatized day after day by bombings, watched as everything that their family had built slowly crumbled around him, and felt the pain of that, yet still felt this resoluteness that he was doing the right thing, until finally reaching the point where he decided that he had to go. And now I think in my conversations with him since, is still at times kind of plagued by this sense of, should we have stayed? Could we have maintained our life there? And so I think that the consequences of those decisions will stay with each of them, and with anyone else who has to make that choice for the rest of their lives. It's not something you can't help but wonder what would have been if I had chosen something different. You can't help but see the good in the choice that you made, but also see the pain that it brought to you and to those that you love. And that's just the brutality of that choice, and the brutality that's the war forces upon people to kind of make these small personal decisions that will stick with them in really painful ways forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Christy, I have a question from Jill Delaney, who asks, the Beekeeper of Aleppo provides such a very stark portrait of the chronic vulnerability and exploitation of the immigrant experience. And yet, through all of the challenge, love, connection, bravery, and determination were the enablers of escape. Can you speak about the universality of this message and continued relevance for today's world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it links a little bit with the previous question in a way, and also very much so with what we're seeing at the moment with what's going on in Russia, with Ukraine. Watching the news and thinking about the experiences of these children and the families, and what it means to try to get to a place of safety, and whether you'll be exploited or not, depending on the color of your skin or your nationality, or and yet at the same time, I think in these sort of really dire situations, I think that's, on the one hand, we can see the worst of humanity, but sometimes we can also see the best of humanity. So, like, for example, when I was working at the center and I saw people really kind of pulling together and coming together to try and make a difference to other people's lives. Just one example that comes to mind, and I'm sure that anyone who's worked with refugees at any point in their life, they'll probably have similar examples. There was a lady that had just given birth to a baby on the journey. So when she arrived, the baby was like 3 weeks old. And this is really meaningful to me now, having just had a baby of my own, and thinking, gosh, you know, I mean, it was hard enough to do it in a hospital, let alone do it on a, you know, have a baby, a newborn baby, while I'm traveling and not knowing if I'll ever return home. But anyway, she arrived at the center, and this little baby, she couldn't produce any breast milk because she was so traumatized. But it was amazing to see people coming together to help her, just holding it's little things like this, just holding the baby for her while she went and had a shower, and loving the baby, you know, not just holding the baby, but showing the baby as much love as possible, just sitting with her. She didn't want to talk to anybody, but every day people would sit quietly with her and just be there, just being there with her. And then eventually she started to talk to people and started to produce milk, and the baby started to feed, and then the baby started to grow. And for me, and then the baby started to smile, and its eyes were opening, and it was communicating in its own way. And, you know, for me, that's like, it's what I always remember that when I think about the courage and the determination and the love that people can show in these kind of situations. Because it wasn't just volunteers that came together to help this woman, it was other people that were equally traumatized. So I know that's one example, but I know that there are so many hundreds of examples like that. So yes, there is exploitation, so much of it, particularly at borders, and people trying to cross borders, and people trying to get to places of safety and being turned away. I mean, at the time when Syrian refugees were trying to get to a place of safety, I remember Macedonia had closed their borders, and everyone was getting stuck in Greece, and Athens was just sort of overflowing with refugees, and they couldn't go anywhere. Nobody wanted them. And you know, so there, and, you know, all this, there's so much. I mean, I could talk about that for hours, but at the same time, at the very same time, there is this, I think, resilience we have as human beings, and this desire to kind of come together and help each other. And it does exist. It's not always there. And sometimes we find the opposite, but it does exist. I hope it exists a lot for the people that are suffering right now as we speak.
Wow. Thanks, Christy.
And if I could pick up on what Christy said, I think, you know, what you've said to both of those questions is really, I think it's important to, or to me, it's always striking in telling these stories that involve so much trauma and death and horror. The moments of joy that people experience are often, incredibly striking and are very, very present. And I think it's important to, for people who have not experienced some of these things to realize kind of the human capacity for joy in the midst of abject terror and fear. And, I can think of a few moments from my reporting for the Road from Raqqa of, there was a moment when Riyadh, the brother who had moved to America, went back to Syria to try to convince his family to leave, and showed up at his family's doorstep without them knowing that he was coming in the midst of the war as ISIS was closing in on the city. And they were immediately wanted him to go back home. They thought that he was bringing danger to them by being there because he was an American, and American hostages were being kidnapped with regularity. And but he talked about that moment of just being back in that home, even as they listened to bombings all night long, even as he'd gone through checkpoint after checkpoint, not knowing if he would survive. He talked about the moment of just sitting at his mother's table and eating breakfast one morning as like one of just a moment that he will cherish for the rest of his life. Another moment that's, and I believe I may have told this story on the panel we did in November, but so I'll try to tell a briefer version of it. But I think it just speaks to this so much. Is Aisha, who is the woman who is the wife of Bashar, the brother who stayed in Syria. She talked to me about this moment when they were in Turkey about to get on a motorized raft to go across the Aegean Sea to get to Greece. And she did not know how to swim. And she talked about going into the water and getting deeper and deeper and deeper, walking alongside the boat, waiting for the moment when she could get up inside and they could begin the journey across. And so many Syrians had died making this exact same journey. Again, she did not know how to swim. Her children did not know how to swim. And she talked about this sense of kind of peace that she began to feel, just knowing that no matter what happened, either she would die and she believed she would meet God in heaven, or she would live and begin a new life for their children. And the moment when she began to feel a real sense of kind of hope, beyond that piece, was on the boat when they were in a moment of where it was quiet and everyone was afraid and it's dark and you can't see anything except for the sea lapping up against the boat. And then this couple who was sitting nearby began bickering with each other over who had the best seat in the boat. Someone wanted to sit on the outside, someone wanted to sit on the inside, someone wanted more room, and they were just going back and forth and back and forth. And in this moment, Aisha and her children started laughing. And then the next thing they knew, like everyone on the boat is just cracking up, just laughing at this, couple fighting over who has the best leg room on this terribly dangerous journey that they're making. and it was that moment, that sense of like, I am facing the greatest fear that I've ever had in my life. I have reconciled myself to the possibility of death, but I have this moment of just like listening to my kids laugh, and it's legitimately funny. And so I think the human capacity to find humor, to find joy, to find connection with people you love and with strangers, these other people who also thought it was funny, is just really important to, I don't know, it gives me hope knowing that kind of humans are capable of finding that even in these dark and terrifying moments.
Do you know what, Jordan? I heard so many stories like that, obviously different, but like that, with that kind of essence. And that's why I wrote the bit where Afra and Nuri are in that kind of little hole that is dug in the garden. And they don't know if they're going to live or die. They don't know if the men are going to find them. They've got a corrugated sheet that's kind of on top of them and they're hiding. And then he says that he wants to fart, and she laughs in his chest, and he says something like it was the most beautiful laugh he'd ever heard, and then her laughter turns to tears. But it was the reason I included that was because I'd heard things like that. I'd heard stories where people were in this situation where it was kind of life or death, and yet they'd found some humor or something to connect with somebody and laugh with somebody, and or remember something lovely. And I just thought, wow, would I be able to do that in a situation like that? But I think we do. I think we do, that we have a capacity that often we don't realize we have. And I think these are some of the things that have really stayed with me from the stories that I heard. So it was very touching to hear that story.
No, nice. I want to follow up with you on something, Christy. It's another question we have. Over and over again, we see long-established families feel they have no other choice but to leave their homes, their birthlands, because of war and because they no longer feel welcome in their own homes. What inspired the story of Nuri and Afra? How do you think we can compare their story to the stories of most others in similar situations?
Well, I think their story is very universal. And the reason I wanted to go and volunteer in the first place, I was going to say the reason I wrote the stories because my parents are also refugees, but that wasn't the reason I wrote it. It was the reason I wanted to go and volunteer. So, I mean, I've described before that so after my mum died about 14 years ago, and after my mum died, my dad moved back to Cyprus. And Cyprus is a tiny little island that faces Syria. So if you got on a little boat from the tip of Cyprus, well, the bit where my dad lives, which is the bit that faces Syria. If you got on a little boat, within about an hour and a half, you'd be in Syria. And I went one spring to visit him. I mean, I go quite often, but it was a very quiet time because normally I go during the summer and there's loads of tourists. And that year, 2016, I went in April. It was very quiet. There was no one on the beach. And I just went for a walk. And I remember looking out across the water and thinking, well, just across there, there's a war, you know, and I'm safe here. But just across there are bombs falling. There are people dying. There are children who are frightened. And it got me thinking about my parents and the journey they had made. My dad was a commanding officer of the war in Cyprus in 1974. And he moved to London when the war was over. My mum moved during the war. They were both refugees. My dad had to, as he said, he was eating fruit off the trees in France in order to survive. And then when he crossed over the channel and got to the UK, my grandmother, who'd already made it to London, came to meet him and said that he had blood in his eyes. And it's an image that I've never forgotten, you know, that she didn't recognize her son, that he had blood in his eyes. And I think sort of knowing that my parents had made those journeys, and I was born a few years later, and seeing their desire to start a new life and what that meant, and then standing there at the beach and looking out and realizing that this doesn't stop with one, you know, it's not as if my parents experienced it and then that was it, that was the last time they were ever refugees. It's that my parents experienced it and people experienced it before and people experienced it after and people will continue to experience it. And I think having that thought, and I remember thinking, I wonder if back then in 1974, someone in Syria was standing at the sea, at the shore, looking over to Cyprus and saying, gosh, there are people over there that are suffering and dying and frightened. So there was that kind of these thoughts were going around in my head, and I felt compelled to do something. Obviously, I couldn't go to Syria, so I decided to go to Athens and volunteer. And it was from that, while I was volunteering, I'd see people come in, and there'd be little flashes in my mind, imagining, would my auntie, my grandmother, my mother, my uncle, would they have been sitting somewhere lost, afraid, making friends, you know, and all the good things as well that we just spoke about, the love, the hope, but also the fear, and would they have experienced all of those things? And then I think because all these questions filled my heart so much, and hearing all the stories as well, and seeing people come to the center and having this willingness to survive, I think all of that sort of filled my heart, made me want to write. So it wasn't necessarily just the experience of Syrian refugees that inspired me to write. It was the experience of refugees, of what it means to be so frightened, to lose your home, to potentially lose everything that you've ever known, of the fact that we have one life, and why do we do this to ourselves, to each other? Why does this happen in the world? Why does it have to happen? You know, and so it was kind of a combination of my parents' experience, me growing up in the shadow of that war, and then hearing the stories of these refugees. So I guess, although Nouri and Afra are Syrian refugees, I think somewhere at the heart of the story, I hope that people find something also universal in it. And I think that was always in my mind, because my parents' experience was also always on my mind while I was volunteering, while I was writing the story.
Wow. Jordan, I want to go back to something you started talking about And this is a question from Jill Delaney again, who's writing some great questions tonight. In The Road from Raqqa, while the narrative focuses primarily on the different choices of the brothers, one interesting character is Bashar's wife, Aisha, who you just mentioned earlier. Her training as a lawyer and keen insights were key to the family's choices. Can you talk more about her story?
Yeah, I would love to. Aisha is, I smile every time I think about her. She's just this incredibly warm, passionate woman who, when in telling, working to tell Bashar and their family story, Riyadh and I traveled to Germany and spent a week with them in their home, and she was in many ways kind of the engine behind the storytelling in that part of the book, because she tells the stories of her experiences so vividly. And so her story is interesting. She, like Riyadh and Bashar, comes from a well-to-do family in Raqqa, a prominent family. She was well educated. She and Bashar married I believe in their 30s, so a little bit later than many people in Syria get married. And she, throughout kind of their wrestling with what to do and how to make their decisions, she was pretty passionate in what she believed. And what she believed from early on was that they should leave. Bashar wanted to stay. Their family operated, and their, at least pocket of Syrian culture, operated in a way that's quite patriarchal. And so because Bashar wanted to stay, it was clear that they were going to stay. But she also felt comfortable, and Bashar felt comfortable hearing her say that she did not think that was the right decision, that she believed that their future was elsewhere, and that their children would find better lives elsewhere. And she had suffered at the hands of the regime. Her family had suffered at the hands of the regime. She had family members who had been imprisoned for speaking out, and she had this skepticism of the Assad regime, whereas Bashar had sort of did not endorse it, did not approve of the Assad regime by any means, but had found a way to kind of function within it. And so Aisha, when the New York Times reviewed my book, it was an incredibly kind review. But the one like line of criticism was that there should have been more Aisha in the book, basically. And I read that, and I was like, you know what? That's right. I wish I could go back and tell a little bit more of her story, because she's a remarkable person, and she. The way in which she talked about wrestling with those choices, the way in which she talked about her joy when Bashar finally said, okay, we can go. The almost kind of like giddiness, sense of elation that she had at taking that chance. And then the peace that she had when she thought that choice might be leading her toward her death, that I talked about earlier. I think you just added another element of texture to the story that's without which the book could not exist. And she's a remarkable person, and I getting to know her was one of the real joys of the whole experience.
Really beautiful. This is we're going to start some questions for both of you now, and this one is from Garth Anderson, and one question for both authors is, in history, Syria moved from clans to tribes to a functioning nation state under Assad. With its civil war, it seems to have fallen back into a battle among tribes. What do you, as the authors and the folks that you encounter during your research and your process, think the future could hold for Syria as a functioning nation? And I guess we'll start with you, Christy.
Oh God, I don't know. I actually don't know.
It's a hard question.
It's obviously a really hard question. And I think, the way I can answer that is I spent so much time writing the novel thinking about the human element rather than putting my energy into thinking, well, I had to read a lot about the political situation so that I could be clear about it. as a backdrop to the story, which, because I wanted to be as informed as I could. And also I had an Arabic teacher. I decided to learn Arabic while I was writing the story, just to kind of get closer to the culture. So he had his own views about the Assad regime and about this, what had happened to Syria and how other countries had contributed to what had happened to Syria. So he was quite clear in his head that that there were a lot of other countries that had actually provoked the situation in Syria. So he had quite, I remember he was quite pessimistic actually about the future of Syria. But then I spoke to other people who were more positive and had a more positive outlook. And I try to sort of not get too much into the political kind of debates. So I did find that when I was interviewing people and political debates started, I would often kind of steer the conversation back to the sort of human elements of, what does it feel like to make these choices about whether to leave or whether to stay. So I guess if I was talking about the future or thinking about the future of Syria, it was in the context of if somebody decided to stay rather than to make the journey and take the risk of leaving, what would that mean? Would they have some sort of, does that mean that they had some sort of hope that things might be better, at some point? Or if I was interviewing people that had already made it to the UK, I would ask the question, do you ever see yourself going back? And what does that mean? And but if someone's asking me that question, I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to what possibly could be the future for Syria. If someone asked me that about Cyprus, which is still divided, I don't know the answer to that either.
It's a legitimate answer. It's very impossible to figure out in the future in some of these places. But I know that Jordan figured it out.
I wish. No, I somewhat similarly, even though I'm a nonfiction writer, I'm a storyteller rather than an analyst, and so I won't at all claim to be an expert on either the history or the present political situation in Syria. But I will say, a couple things regarding kind of the tribal culture and this idea that and I'm not saying that this was the idea necessarily inherent in the question, but I've heard it elsewhere. But this idea that there's this tribal culture that then coalesced into kind of a functioning state and now has devolved back into tribalism. I would push back on that a little bit. I think the founding of the Syrian state, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the treaty that drew the borders in Syria and elsewhere, other neighboring countries, was a decision made by colonial powers, not a decision made locally. And so there was kind of as is the case in many parts of the world, borders are extremely arbitrary things that are drawn, dividing up pockets of culture that feel, or pockets of land that feel very connected culturally, where now you can have, this is Syria and this is Iraq, but we share all these cultures and traditions, or this is Syria and this is Turkey, but we're connected in these ways. While an hour down the road in another direction, there's someone who is, a pocket of culture that is technically Syria, but where there aren't the same kind of cultural ties. And so, the borders of the country were fairly arbitrary and not drawn by Syrians. And so I think certainly the tribal aspect of the culture, and particularly in the region of Syria that Riyad and Bashar are from, Raqqa, it is just to kind of describe a little bit about what it's like culturally. You know, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from the South, and Riyadh, who now lives in Tennessee, often talks about kind of the desert region where Raqqa is as almost like the South in Syria, in terms of the way that you have the cosmopolitan kind of elites that live in Aleppo and Damascus, and they kind of look down on people from the desert, and they and the people in the desert have this kind of like tight-knit tribalism. And so that region is certainly very, very tribal, and always has been. And when you talk to Riyadh about kind of his pride and where he's from, it's not a pride in being Syrian, it's a pride in being from Raqqa. And similarly, a lot of people from Syria who I've spoken to did not really have any sort of kind of a nationalistic kind of pride until the revolution began, and until there was this sense that they could fight for the future of what they wanted Syria to be. Prior to that, it had just been a pride in being from, you know, their particular neighborhood in Aleppo, or their particular family. And so, yeah, all that to say, I think the tribal aspects of the culture have always been there, and I think have been in many ways sustaining and nurturing to a lot of people's lives, and will certainly continue. What that means for the future rule of Bashar al-Assad, or the potential successor to Bashar al-Assad, I don't know. But I do think that the way that we think about what constitutes a nation, and the way that cultures are bound together by geographical borders, you know, sometimes leads us astray a little bit.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a question, another one for both of you. I'm going to tie in two questions here because they're sort of similar, but they're both great. This one comes from Drew Wichterman. What connections can be made between the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Syria as you're observing it? And on top of that, the refugees fleeing Ukraine often say that they are in Poland or other bordering countries waiting to return to their homes. In the Syrian crisis, a new home in a new country with new jobs seem to be the goal. Is this a fair assessment? And if so, what's the difference between the two situations when you look at Ukraine and Syria?
Regarding the second point about refugees from Ukraine wanting to return home, and refugees from Syria often looking for new homes elsewhere, I think the main difference there is time. I mean, the war in Syria has been going on for more than a decade now. The war in Ukraine is only weeks old, and so I think that there is this sense. It's easier to have a sense of hope that soon the situation will change and you'll be able to return to your home. I think another key difference is the fact that the war in Ukraine is a war enacted by another sovereign state. It's a war enacted by Russia against Ukraine. People leaving Syria are leaving a country that has fallen into a civil war, and that civil war came about because the country they were living in before was ruled by a dictator, and the country they were living in before did not give them the kind of freedoms that we enjoy, and that all people want, I believe. Ukrainians had those freedoms. Ukrainians had a country that they were deeply proud of, a country that's, I won't claim to be an expert on kind of the pre-war politics in Ukraine, but that there was a sense that this was a place that was not rife with the same kind of problems that would lead to a civil war. So I think that's a really critical difference. Is just the fact that this is another sovereign state declaring war on this country, rather than people rising up and that uprising turning into civil war because of the rule of a dictator.
I think I agree. I agree with what Jordan is saying, but I'm also at the same time thinking about some of the interviews and some of the people that I spoke to. And I think there were most of the people that I spoke to wanted to return home and imagined that at some stage they would be able to. However, I do agree with what you're saying, Jordan, because it it was so complicated in their minds. The idea of returning home was such a complicated thing, that often people spoke about it in a sort of dreamlike way, you know, almost like wish upon a star sort of thing. And just to go on from there, for the second part of the question that you asked, in terms of the differences, I hate to say this, but I have noticed in the UK, I don't know what it's like anywhere else, but there has been a difference in how Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed, as opposed to how Syrian refugees were welcomed or unwelcomed. And I think this has, it's been quite shocking to see that there was actually quite a clear difference in how the refugees were described so differently by certain media outlets. It's, and I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who's from Syria herself, and she was quite upset about this because there was something in the Daily Mail, for example, encouraging people to host Ukrainian refugees in their homes, and actually when Syrian refugees needed as much help as possible, often the opposite was portrayed in the media. It was kind of like, look at all these refugees coming in, we're at breaking point. It was at that time when Brexit was happening as well. There was this real kind of, so it has been quite upsetting to see that there has been a difference. And I hate to kind of say it, but actually it's clear there has been a difference. So I don't really know what to say about that, apart from it's very, very sad. But what can we say? But that's I just think it's really sad, and people from Syria are, like my friend was genuinely heartbroken and saying, well, why is this presented differently now? Why were we less welcome than other refugees?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And this next question sort of dovetails on that a little bit. I'll start it with Jordan, but it's really one that you both can answer. But Jordan, your book illustrates the often problematic view of America as an ideal land or as the potential savior. Riyad's view of America evolves after living there. There's also a conversation toward the end of the book between Riyad and a young girl in a refugee camp where she expresses a strong belief that if America knows what is happening, they will come to the rescue. How prevalent is the refugee view of America as a savior in your research?
That's the anecdote you mentioned at the end of that question about the conversation between Riyad and that girl is one that Riyad speaks about often. I just saw him the other night, and often when we're together, he will bring up that conversation. So for those who don't know, Riyad, on his visit to Syria, he stopped in a refugee camp in Turkey, and there he met a little girl who was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. And when he told her that he was from America, she became really, really excited. And she pointed to kind of the electrical towers that were nearby. And she told him that she believed that those towers were somehow blocking the news, because in Syria, that no foreign news or information can get into the country. The government has ways of kind of keeping out foreign media. And so she'd grown up learning that these towers somehow block the news, and so they don't get the news in Syria. And so she told Riyadh that she believed that these towers that she saw were blocking the news, and it wasn't getting to America. That America did not know what was happening to her, what was happening to her family, what was happening to their country. Because surely if they did, and I don't think she knew very much about America other than it was a powerful country full of human beings. And she believed that any human beings who had the power to stop what was happening to her and to her family would do so. And she asked Riyadh to tell Americans what was happening, because she believed that that if they knew, that they would act. And Riyadh told her that he would, because he did not know what else to say. He, of course, knew that Americans knew very well what was going on in Syria. At least some did. And at that point, had not given much aid. And that's a conversation that has kind of haunted Riyadh ever since. He talks about going and trying to find this girl, and find a way to kind of make a new life for her. That said, I would say that the view toward America of other people that I talk to, related to this book and not related to this book, and at times was somewhat similar to that. Not the sense of not the sense of America as a great force for either good or evil in the world, but just as a powerful country filled with people. And if you are a person, how could you not want to do something in the face of this kind of suffering? And so I think that, the decisions that the Obama administration, and later the Trump administration, have made surrounding the war are complicated and could be debated by people with more understanding of the way the military works and the complicated geopolitics than I have. But I will say that I did encounter this sense of disappointment and abandonment among a number of people who I spoke to, a number of people who, when they found out I was American, were excited to talk to me, but who felt let down by this powerful country that had not done more to help in the face of what they were enduring.
And Christy, you don't have to answer in terms of America, but if you want to just tie it into the West, even from your point of view.
What was interesting is that the smugglers, it cost more to go to the UK than any other European country. And when I asked about this, like why was there a greater price attached to the UK, it's because people had the idea that the UK was the best place to get to. And the irony was that, of course, it wasn't. And Brexit and, it was happening almost simultaneously. But people had this idea that if they got to the UK, people would help them, that they'd be helped and more, and that they would be safer. And it was just this sort of idea that was floating around that was kind of apparently true. So when I spoke to people and they knew that I'd come from the UK, they'd say, gosh, we wouldn't even dream of trying to get there. It's too expensive. So I said, well, why is it so expensive? And they'd say, well, it's more expensive, for example, than going to Denmark. And I'd say, well, why is that? And so the desired place, for some reason, had become the UK. Because it was just like almost like a story. It was like sort of Chinese whispers, and it had become sort of more idealized as the story kind of went from one ear to the other. And it was genuinely more expensive to get there. So I imagine that people, I don't know, that the UK, like America, I suppose, seemed to them like a powerful country that had the resources to help, which is not necessarily the case in terms of, you know, how helpful the UK was, but it was definitely the story going around to the point where it was very expensive to get there.
If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to have another question just for you, Christy, but you know, we'll give Jordan a specific question in a second. When did you decide that your character was a beekeeper? What led you to the bees, and in what ways are bees metaphor in this novel?
So it was weird because I'd created the characters. So I had Nouri and Afra and Mustafa and Sami. And I was thinking, I want Nouri to do something that's kind of linked to nature. And I want this thing that he does to kind of bring out his personality, or to show us something about his personality and his sensitivity and his kind of his connection to his homeland. And I was thinking about it, and I wasn't sure. At one point, I remember being interested in the damask rose and thinking that maybe he would be doing something to do with that. And then I went to bed one night and I woke up, and I don't know where this came from, and I just said, "Oh my God, Nouri's a beekeeper." It was just, he is a beekeeper. It was almost as if he was always a beekeeper, and I just realized it, that I had just discovered it, but actually that's what he was already. That was the feeling I had, like there was no other job that was for him. It had to be that one. So as soon as I realized that, I quickly started to overload my brain with information about beekeeping. I did loads of research, and then eventually came across an article about a man called Dr. Riyad Al-Sus, who was a beekeeper and a professor of agriculture at Damascus University. And he'd made his way from Syria to the UK and settled in Yorkshire. So he was one of the luckier refugees, in the sense that he did manage to come over here with his family, and he did manage to settle in Yorkshire. And he set up something called the Buzz Project, where he is now still doing it. He teaches refugees and job seekers how to keep bees. So as soon as I saw this article about him, I was like, oh my goodness, gosh, you know, I have to contact this man. So I sent him a message on Facebook Messenger, and had my fingers crossed. I said to him, look, what you're doing is absolutely amazing. I said to him, I don't know you, but I'm in awe of you, your strength, your courage, you know, what you've achieved and what you're doing is so inspiring. And I told him what I was doing, you know, that I'd started writing this novel and why I had started to write it. And he replied the next day. And although he didn't know me, he said, "Dearest Christy," and which is why Mustafa in the novel, in his letters, calls Nouri "Dearest Nouri." It came directly from the way that Riyad was talking to me, because I found it so warm. And anyway, so we ended up speaking on the phone, and he invited me up to Huddersfield to meet him and his family and to meet the bees. And so, you know, up until that point, all my research was reading books, reading articles. And then I got to go and visit this wonderful man and meet his family. And, you know, there was this point where he said to me, do you want to meet the bees in the garden? Because he had the apiaries, and he said, but we can see the garden bees as well, but I don't have any protective gear. Do you still want to go and see them? And I said, well, how many beehives are there? And he said, about 5. No, 5, he said, or 6. I can't quite remember if he said 5 or 6, but somewhere around there. So I was, oh, that's not too many. That's fine. I don't mind. It doesn't matter that I don't have protective gear. Let's go. And so when I got there, I just remember, and this was the most amazing and frightening experience, like hundreds of bees being around me, and that smell So it's such a sensory experience, because it's the sound, it's the smell, it's the fear. I felt so alive and so afraid and so inspired at the same time, that there's a bit in the story where Mustafa introduces Nuri to the bees, and Nuri stands with his hand like this and stands very still, because that's what Mustafa advises. That's what I had to do. So you stand like that so that the bees don't sting your eyes. And that experience of standing there, I used directly in the story when Nuri meets the bees. And I guess going then to the apiaries, hearing Riyadh talking about the bees and how they work together as a society for the good of the society, you know, and how all sorts of things that I learned from him about nurturing bees, about the world and how we need bees, and, you know, and just little things like what he does on a day-to-day basis. His, you know, the fact that he had to kind of look after these bees, and you know, all sorts of things that I learned from him. I started to think about the story and what these bees meant, in contrast to kind of how these bees work together, and in contrast to how, you know, what's going on in the world and the wars and how we're sort of trying to destroy each other. And here's these bees, and they're kind of working in harmony with each other. And so it was that metaphor that actually Riyadh kept bringing up himself, that he believed that the bees had a perfect society, that I wanted to kind of have as part of the sort of essence of, you know, the metaphor, the kind of subtle metaphor. I hope it was subtle, but, you know, that there was a metaphor in the background of the story about how the bees are as opposed to how we are. And also with bees, you know, this idea of hope as well, where we spoke earlier about hope.
Right.
That you know, they represent new life and flowers and nature, and so there's that idea of renewal and nature and life.
Yeah. Did you say the real beekeeper's name was Dr. Seuss?
Riyadh Al-Seuss.
Al-Seuss. Okay. I thought I heard Dr. Seuss. I'm like, wow.
Oh,
okay. So fitting. But Jordan, there's a quote on page 28 of your book. I know you don't know it offhand. I'm going to read it to you. It speaks to the connection between food, hospitality, family, and community, mentioning the bakery as a place where, quote, they gathered, stitched together by a shared need. How does this connection help them endure through difficulty?
You know, I spoke earlier about the moment when Riyadh showed up at his family's doorstep in the midst of the war, and how just sitting at his mother's table was just this moment of incredible joy and comfort and peace in the midst of all of this chaos. And you know, Riyadh is you know, works as a chef. He owns a restaurant here in the Nashville area, and you know, food is deeply important to him because of the ways in which he feels like he can communicate his culture to others through feeding them. And you know, to go back to that moment in the bakery, you know, that this was a time when the city of Raqqa was falling to the rebels, when no one knew who had taken over their city. They just knew that it was no longer the government. And soon it would be ISIS. It was, you know, initially it was more democratic rebels that took over the city, but ISIS saw an opportunity and eventually fought with them and overtook it themselves. And you know, that moment of going to the bakery, this was this kind of daily practice before the war. You buy fresh bread at the bakery every day to bring it home and to feed your family. And when you go, you stand in line and you run into people. You see friends, you see neighbors, you see a classmate from high school who you haven't caught up with in many years. and that sense of this shared need, we all need to be fed, we all need to eat, bringing people together, and that moment served as this place where they could try to find out what was going on, where they could try to survive. I mean, they are feeding themselves to survive, and they are talking to each other, sharing information about the war, to try to survive as well. And so in that instance, food does that out of necessity. You know, that there are moments when food can do something similar, in settings that are not overlaid with all of the kind of danger that was present then. But you know, a moment such as, you know, when Riyadh feeds people, these, you know, people in Hendersonville, Tennessee, where he runs his restaurant, he feels like he is giving them a window into his home, giving them a window into this life that he left. And he feels like he is shaping the way that they see people like him, the way that they see strangers, the way that they see the immigrant, the refugee, by kind of entering into his world and eating the food that his mother and his grandmother taught him to make, that he hopes to kind of impact, impact the way that they see the world and the way that they interact with the world. And so, you know, certainly the different functions that food can have are present throughout the book, because it's so deeply important to each of the brothers and to anyone. It's something that's so just deeply ingrained in our everyday lives that sometimes we don't think critically about it. But when we do, it's pretty remarkable, all the functions that it can have.
Mm. I have a question here that I mean, I'm going to turn it into like basically two questions, but I think it'll appeal to both of you. We've read a number of books where characters have had to deal with impossible situations that have resulted in post-traumatic stress. How do your characters cope with impossible situations and how they manifest in their lives? And I'd also like to make it more personal to you authors, because this is a question I get asked a lot. When you're deep into these stories, what do you do for self-care to manage your own humanity and health when you're dealing with such heartbreaking themes and research?
Shall I go first?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Christy.
Or was that for Jordan first?
It was really for you first, but you know, if you want a little more time, we can.
No, that's fine. I'll answer the second bit first, because I felt really like, I don't know, when I got back from volunteering, I found it really difficult, and I felt really guilty about this, because I thought, well, what right do I have to feel so awful because I'm not the one that's been through a war? But I just found it really difficult to live how I lived before, which somebody might think, well, maybe that's a good thing because you've learned a lot that you didn't know before. But I genuinely could not walk down the street without feeling guilty that I was walking down that street. So, and then I kept thinking, well, you know, all these children that hadn't made it to Athens, and that just kept going around in my head to the point where I think I was kind of obsessing about it, which in one way was good because it allowed me to put those feelings into the novel, but in another way wasn't good because I felt kind of lost with it. I didn't really know how to, I don't know, like, I think we have to, in some way, take for granted that we're alive. And I couldn't take it for granted. I was constantly aware that I was living and that I was alive and that I was in the UK, which was the place where so many people wanted to be. So I couldn't take those things for granted. And so I walked around with a lot of guilt all the time. And I just couldn't settle. I just remember maybe I broke down a little bit. I don't know. I just found it hard to like water my plants or just do normal things that I would normally have done. I remember finding it really, really hard to do normal everyday tasks, that somehow I became consumed by what I was imagining other people were going through. So I did find it really, really hard, but I do feel guilty that I found it really hard.
Wow.
And, you know, and in terms of the trauma, I think because I wanted, so at first the story was about, do they make it to the UK? Then when I spoke to so many people and understood the way that trauma manifested itself in people's lives, and also I'd worked as a psychotherapist beforehand, and I'd done a psychoanalytic training. So all the idea of trauma and how it manifests in people's lives was something that I was really interested in, especially since my dad was an officer during the war that I mentioned before in 1974, and he suffered from PTSD and didn't know that he was suffering from PTSD, and it came out in his reactions to us, which I then had to kind of have therapy years later to try and understand and piece it all together. So I guess where the story was linear, it was, do they make it to the UK? When I started writing it, I realized that wasn't the question, that wasn't the thread. The real question wasn't, do they make it to the UK? So therefore I could start with that and fragment the story so that I had, well, let's start with the UK. So the question isn't, do they make it to the UK? The question is, how does Nouri overcome his post-traumatic stress disorder, or slightly overcome it to the point where he can reconnect with his wife? And the fact that he can't cry for his son means that he hallucinates. So in order to overcome his hallucinations, he has to deal with the loss and the trauma. So this was something that I understood from living with my dad for my whole life, growing up, and also from working as a psychotherapist, and also speaking to people that had themselves experienced trauma and seeing things as well. Like, for example, a guy who used to sit outside, you know, where I mentioned the men sitting outside the center. There was this one guy who would come and sit outside, but he didn't have a family in the center. He just sat there and he was cutting his wrists, and he was holding a photograph. He'd lost his ability to speak, and he wasn't communicating with anyone. He was holding a photograph of his mother and two brothers who had died in the war. And eventually someone told me, but I didn't hear him, his first words that he was able to say was, "I miss you," to the photographs. So, you know, all around me, I could see how trauma was manifesting itself in people's lives, and it was really heartbreaking. And then I went to the UK and kind of carried it with me, not knowing what to do with it. And so what I did with it was I put it into the story. I put that deep sadness that I felt, I just said, well, I don't know what else to do with this, so I'm going to write it.
That makes perfect sense. It was really interesting how you came to that. I was wondering where, as someone who has training in this, where you were going to go. That seems to be the greatest answer. Jordan, you want to try and tackle that one?
Yeah. You know, for me, as a journalist, the moments in my work, and there were a few of them in writing this book, but they come up elsewhere too. The moments in my work that are the most, that I love the most, I guess. Love might be a strange word, but the feeling that I often find myself chasing is the feeling when you are interviewing someone who has just gotten to a place where they have felt comfortable sharing something incredibly vulnerable with you, often something related to a traumatic experience in their lives. And they go to that place that as a journalist, you're always hoping someone will go to, which is where they can talk about the traumatic memory in a way that describes how it felt in their body, how it felt, what was going through their minds, what the room looked like, what it smelled like, what they felt and experienced in that moment, and then how that memory stuck with them afterwards. When they go to that place and they share those things with you, and you end that interview, and for me, I always feel this intense pressure, this sense that they have given me this gift of their vulnerability, of their trust to take what they have told me and to share it with an audience, and the sense of pressure to do it right. That there's an intensity I often find to that feeling of pressure, to that sense that you have been given this gift of someone's story, and it's now your responsibility to tell it and tell it well. And that is the feeling that I like when it happens. I find myself just feeling like, oh, that's what I'm chasing. That's what I love about this work. And in writing this book, that the moment when that happened most profoundly was talking to Bashar we were in Germany. Riyadh and I were there, and for some reason, we found the place for us to talk most best every day was to go to a mall food court. And so every day we would just go and sit for hours in this food court in the mall, and we would talk. And Bashar doesn't speak much English, so Riyadh would mostly translate for us. And Bashar one day began telling the story of this moment when he's on the boat with his family, and they begin to hit a lot of waves, and he begins to have the sense of, everyone begins to have the sense of fear that the boat could capsize. And Bashar knows how to swim. His wife Aisha does not know how to swim. His children, Janan, Wajid, and Abdul Rahman, none of them know how to swim. And Bashar has this moment of, if the boat goes down, who will I save? And that, remembering that feeling and the fear that came with that feeling. And then he had this moment where he locked eyes with his daughters, and he could see that they saw the fear on his face. He began telling that story with Riyadh there translating, but then Riyadh had to run to get a refill or go to the restroom. And Bashar tried to continue telling it in English. He speaks more English than I speak Arabic. And by the time Riyadh got back, both of us had tears in our eyes. And he finished the story with Riyadh there. But that moment, leaving an interview like that, knowing that this person has gone to a place that is very difficult to go to. It's very difficult to access those memories, to share those memories, to feel comfortable speaking them out loud. When you have that sense of again, the pressure to try to do justice to what they've given you, that for me is something that I'm often chasing. And so my therapist might say that this is not the way to deal with these things, but I often find that like the writing functions as the self-care, at least in the wake of those kinds of experiences, because the writing, if I do it well, and I will say that writing that scene of the book was just a deeply meaningful experience for me, just sitting down and trying to write that scene and trying to do justice to what Bashar gave me in that moment. So that's for me personally. For Riyadh and Bashar, and I can only speak for them rather than for others from Syria who I've spoken with, in terms of how they kind of deal with some of the trauma that they've experienced. I mean, I think both of them would point to their faith. Would point to just kind of the daily religious practice of Islam, and as something that has been sustaining for them, both as they were experiencing all of these things and as they kind of integrate these terrible memories into their continuing lives. And I think there's something about the ritual of that faith that is sustaining to them, that just the daily act of prayer. The kind of holding to these practices that were part of their lives long before the trauma, that were part of their lives during the trauma, and that are now part of their lives after the trauma. So for them, I would say that is most likely kind of what they would point to.
Oh, thank you. Listen, that was really a great conversation. I really appreciate Christy and Jordan just taking the time to talk about these two brilliant books. Let me get those in there. There we go. Oh, it's blurring. That's terrible. All right. Well, we see it. This has been another Turn the Page event. There will be more coming in the future. I want to also thank the Tip City Public Library for sponsoring this. Special thanks to Sharon Rabb, Nick Rains, and Emily, and everybody else at the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you both for coming, especially you, Christy, you're on a different time zone here. Jordan's going to be up for a while watching sports. We know that. But thank you all very much, and it was great to see
It's been a real
virtually see
pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much. So great to see both of you, and thanks everyone who's been done.
Yeah, thank you from me as well.
Great. Take care now. We'll see you.